Hello, welcome to a Third Apron podcast. I am your host, Yossi Goslin, NBA salary cap analyst. Today, we are going to talk about the Sixers offseason, all the moves they did. Joining me from last time, Aaronson. We are going to talk about each move step by step. I'll go over how the Sixers did each thing procedurally with the salary cap rules and just give our thoughts on what they did and see what they could potentially do next. That is all coming up. Adam, thanks for joining the show again. How are you doing?
I am doing well. I'm not thinking about and writing about the sorts of things I anticipated I'd be thinking about and writing about in August, the last time we talked. But it's certainly been a fun and interesting summer here.
Yeah, good off season for sure. Definitely one for the one like an all timer. It
Yeah.
really crept up on us. Like we knew there were some trades that were gonna happen, and like almost all of them did happen. Like every guy, like from Giannis to Kawhi, that was rumored to get traded ended up getting traded, and then some more guys, as we will discuss in relation to the Sixers switching teams as well. And July is usually a time where I don't do quite as much content because I'm also kind of just still like processing everything that's happening in real time. There's just so much to do. So if I'm able to write something, podcast something, I feel pretty fortunate. And now I can finally like sit back, really go through everything now that it's the dust is starting to settle. So Adam was on the show in, I think it was April or May. We talked about this, probably May, yeah, after the Sixers got eliminated. And we discussed what they could do. And the big theme about the big question that was basically weighing on what the decisions you made and like the direction we both felt was appropriate was that the Sixers were stuck in between a rock and a hard place. They're like, fine, they're a pretty good team, but obviously not a championship contender. And their path to becoming one seemed really, really limited by these contracts, specifically Joel Embiid got 3 years, 60-ish million annually. Paul George, 2 years, 56 million-ish annually. And it seemed like they were going to have to give up significant draft equity just to really move these players and not necessarily get like an upgrade. Maybe you get some fine depth, maybe you get some cap flexibility so you could set the table to do something else later. And where you and I felt was that it would probably be not worth the draft equity given what historically, at least in recent years, would actually be available to the Sixers. So before we move forward, here's what just I want to show what we ended up doing.
This is gonna look so laughable in retrospect now that they have LeBron on the minimum.
So
What I did.
but we both agreed that running it back would seem like the most likely option. So can you just bring everybody back on a pretty good deal? So you re-signed Quentin Grimes, Kelly Oubre. Basically, Oubre gets around kind of what he got, maybe a little less. We declined Dominic Barlow and gave him the most the Sixers could give him with his non-bird rights, and then traded for Justin Champagnie and Day'Ron Sharp with some of the guys that it was like some of the minimum guys to make the salary matching work. Pretty simple trades procedurally. Basically, you're within the first apron, give or take. Yeah, how do you? I would say, obviously, when we get through the moves, I don't think any of us could have imagined that the Sixers could have pulled off what they did this offseason. But let's just start with the departures of Quentin Grimes and Kelly Oubre specifically. It seemed like getting him back, like or at least two of them back, was going to be a little bit of a pipe dream, I think, and especially seeing the contract that Quentin Grimes got. I don't think like I think that contract is like kind of paying for the kind of guy Quentin Grimes was last year instead of the previous year, not the recent season. So I understand just not retaining him. I would say like given what they got back, I think that letting these guys go, who they replace him with, that ultimately end up being the right decision. Mainly, you had Oubre kind of being the four, like him and PG. I mean, it's like one of them are kind of they're just that's the front core. I think to get Dean Wade, who can actually like he's a now one of your best defenders. That's a great Oubre replacement. Losing Grimes, you've got LeBron, uh, but then also you've got Anthony Simons to replace that element of shooting. Grimes was like it's like historically been like a 35+% shooter, kind of had a dip last year, but I think that's kind of the replacement. So overall, it not only did they upgrade the roster, but they I think they found adequate replacement for these two.
Yeah, when we, went through the mock off season back in May, I wasn't sort of overly enthusiastic about the idea of re-signing both Grimes and Oubre, but I just wasn't sure for a team that already had significant depth issues how they weren't going to continue to lose depth letting either of those guys go. They had to let them both walk, given the nature of their cap sheet, to open up the full mid-level exception. I thought it was going to be challenging to use that, $15 million to bring back more value than both of those players combined. I thought, maybe they go for like Rui Hachimura, who is a better player than both of those guys for sure, but I'm not sure that he's more valuable than both of them combined, especially for a team that, like I said, already had depth issues. But to split that up between ultimately Dean Wade and Anthony Simons, I think is really nice work. I think Dean Wade, I mean, even before the LeBron James signing, which I don't think the Sixers made any of these moves with LeBron in mind. They did make all of the free agency moves with Jaylen Brown in mind. I think even once Jaylen Brown was on board, I think Dean Wade at that number is a little more sensible than Kelly Oubre at about the same average annual value. Dean Wade with an extra year and then a very lightly guaranteed fourth season on that. And this is a team that was bottom third in the NBA last year in 3-point volume and 3-point accuracy. Simons is a flawed player. I think everyone knows he's probably one of the worst defensive players in the NBA, frankly. But he's also one of the, in my opinion, one of the most underrated 3-point shooters in recent history. And they really needed that even before they got LeBron, who is obviously someone that we all know can thrive playing alongside shooting of that caliber, or maybe I should say shooters of that caliber can thrive playing alongside him. So I thought it was somewhat of a risk to let both of those guys go. Ultimately, I would not have ended up wanting to retain Grimes at 4 years, 60 with a player option. Regardless, I just think there's a good chance for the Sixers that ended up being a negative value contract, especially after the LeBaron Fallon Jr. pick in the first round, where you now have a third guard potentially sort of in your pipeline where there's less of a need for someone like Grimes. So I think strong work. To me, that was the most impressive part of the Sixers offseason until the obvious shocking news a few weeks later was that they managed to let both of those guys go. And in my opinion, upgrade in each spot using the full mid level.
Do you think the Sixers will miss the elite corner shooting of Andre Drummond and his surprisingly really strong passing ability in recent years?
I will tell you what I can guarantee you is that I will miss the Andre Drummond corner 3-point shooting. That was my favorite sort of subplot of the 25-26 Sixers. It was the absolute best. I went on a Knicks podcast and raved about it. I do think that if you're talking seriously about, if you look at this depth chart now, including LeBron James, believe it or not, if you want to find a weak point, it's the backup center spot. They've got a Dembona and Ariel Hukporti. They're both unproven players, especially Hukporti, who has only played, I think, like 750 minutes or so in 2 years in the NBA. He was, of course, blocked by Karl Anthony Towns and Mitchell Robinson in New York, and now he sort of switches places with Drummond, who's going to also replace Mitchell Robinson. But I do think the Sixers will actually kind of miss that. It was, I don't want to say it added a dimension to their offense because it's not as if they were ever running plays around it, but it added somewhat of like a safety valve, especially at the ends of shot clocks where he could just sort of float to the corner. I'm probably giving way too long of an answer for what was mostly just a joke so that everybody can
Yeah.
remember that Andre Drummond shot 36% on corner threes last year, but I think they'll miss it a little bit, but I think they wanted more athleticism, more mobility in that backup center spot, and I think both guys they have can really thrive in transition offense, and it's going to be on them to show that they can, protect the rim and defensive rebound at a level high enough to really stabilize that spot.
Yeah, the Sixers won't miss Andre Drummond per se, but I think based on their departures, I suppose they replaced him the least.
Yeah,
Because I think with Hukporti and Adembona, they're like Bona's like way more of an like explosive athletic kind of leaper where Porty, honestly, I'm not like less familiar with what with his game because like he just plays so less. He just didn't
Yeah.
play that much at all for the Knicks. But like they both like are third bigs, so we'll see what the Sixers end up doing. We'll address at the end like what could come next, and that could also stem from maybe even like an Embiid trade if it comes to that. But overall, they pretty much did a really good job as far as not just adding to the roster, but replacing their outgoing players with really good value contracts, in my opinion. So let's just walk through what they did. I keep a log of all their cap sheets step by step. So here's the Sixers cap sheet before making any transactions and while they still had pending options. So they had team options for Dominic Barlow, 3.4 million, Trendon Watford, 2.8 million, Dalen Terry, 2.6 million. Of those three, only Terry would remain non-guaranteed. So we both concluded it just made sense to pick it up because it remained non-guaranteed after, so you could keep that salary for trade purposes. Meanwhile, Jabari Walker and Adam Bona were non-guaranteed, but Bona became fully guaranteed, which that's a no-brainer. They would pick it up, and then with Walker, he got 250K guaranteed, and I think it's going to does it remain 250K to start the year? Okay.
January 10 becomes fully guaranteed.
All right. So they basically retained everybody except Trendon Watford, who I think I saw in the news he's going overseas now.
He
So,
There was a report that he was going overseas, and then he tweeted something about uh, false news or fake news or something. So it's unclear.
oh,
But there was a
okay.
report that he's going to Spain, but we'll see if that actually holds true.
Okay. So then here is the Sixers roster. Basically the same thing. This is their slate heading into the offseason, 17 million under the luxury tax line. You and I both discussed how in the last 3 years, these Sixers have made it an objective to, okay, if you're going to start the season above the tax line, get below it later. And the roster that we put together for the mock off season reflected that, where they were close enough where they could get under it later. And I think like where the Sixers were like on June 30th versus what transpired like one day after, truly unexpected stuff. I was live streaming during the start of free agency, and I was saying that I think, like, I think, despite what you and I concluded, Adam, that the Sixers they got a new front office. They're probably not at all tied to the guys that were brought in, other than Maxey and Edgecombe. It felt like there's going to be a motivation to do something, be aggressive, use some of their draft equity to upgrade the roster in trade either Paul George or Joel Embiid, because otherwise they're just wasting Tyrese Maxey's prime, in my opinion. And like right now, we know he's at his best. I think he'll have a good long prime, but he's a top 20-ish player, in my opinion, right now. And I think they got to maximize it. Otherwise, like honestly, consider trading him. That was June 30th. And then one day later, they went ahead and did the Jaylen Brown trade. So there was some aggression there. But before that, I'm going to go in order. They signed Dean Wade. 4-year contract, $38.7 million. Last year, how much is guaranteed in the last year?
I forget what it's like 1.35 or something. It takes the total guarantee of the contract to 30 million exactly.
Okay. So very small partial guarantee in the last year.
Very small.
Yeah. So when I was doing contract projections for upcoming free agents and extension eligible players, I was a lot higher on Dean Wade, I think, than consensus. I was saying I wouldn't if I'm another team who's trying to steal him away from the Cavs, I would go as like maybe not the full mid level, but on a short term deal, but something like pretty close. Like I wouldn't be opposed to going to like 13 mil and but keep it on like a 2-year deal. Just because that's probably not a number the Cavs are going to want to pay. So the Sixers, obviously, there is the connection with Mike Gansey having just been with the Cavs, taking over for the Sixers. He went in and got his guy and went more on the years. So clearly, because I know Wade, I think, is already like late 20s. So this will stretch into his early 30s, this contract. but he believes in him enough that he wanted to get the AAV down and give him years. So he went as far in the years as he could, and essentially, like I guess you can call it a 3-year deal since the last year is mostly non guaranteed. Overall, I'm fine with it. And I think within the context of the Sixers, it's a pretty important deal. Yeah, I know that now LeBron's in and he's going to marginalize him a little bit, but I like is him and Jalen Brown are like the two best defenders there, I would say, right? And I'm sure he's gonna be factoring in really prominently in certain lineups. Maybe like we'll see what the combinations are, but maybe there's some late game combinations where like maybe Edgecombe isn't playing and you're closing with Wade, and we saw what he did against the Raptors, like completely shutting down Ingram. He's not gonna shut down like other all stars like every time, but either way, like a guy that just the Sixers had not like type of
Yeah.
player the Sixers have not really had, I guess. He's not as good as Matisse Thybulle defensively, but I just like in terms of like the best, like I guess he might be their best on ball defender since then, unless I'm missing someone.
Yeah, he might be. I think you're right to point out the lineup part of this. I've got a story coming out on Philly Voice on Wednesday the 5th. I don't know when this will be out, but on Wednesday there will be a story up just sort of playing around with a bunch of different lineups that the Sixers could lean on over the course of next season beyond just the obvious starting five that everybody has probably seen on 100 different, fantasy basketball looking graphics by now. My primary takeaway from that was just how valuable it is that Dean Wade basically fits in with any combination of four players. And on a team that now has either four or five incredibly high usage offensive players, depending on how you would classify VJ Edgecombe, to have players like Dean Wade, I think this is true of Dominic Barlow as well. If the Sixers get a good season out of Contavious Caldwell Pope, he's another one that sort of fits this mold. Guys that can be additive in certain ways on both ends of the floor. And for Wade, it's much more on defense than offense, but he is a fine spot up 3-point shooter with a pretty quick trigger. To have guys that can be additive on both ends of the floor just without taking up almost any offensive usage is so valuable on a team like this. I liked the Dean Wade contract before the LeBron signing, and he was going to slot in as the starting four. I think there were more reasonable concerns at that point because Dean Wade is someone who's never played more than I think 22 minutes a game. If you look at his basketball reference page, he has, missed a lot of time over a lot of years. He's not exactly a good bet to play 82 games. And the Sixers, you know, like it was a mixed bag at times with Kelly Oubre, but when he was on the floor, he was playing big minutes, and he was sort of a similar player in that the Sixers could slot him into basically any unit of five guys, and his fit would make enough sense. I think Wade is better at sort of adding value to a team without having the ball in his hands than Oubre is. I think he's a more steady defender. He's a more accurate 3-point shooter on roughly the same volume. I think it's a strong signing. I don't know if this sounds counterintuitive or not because he's no longer going to start when he would have before LeBron. I actually like the Dean Wade signing more now that they have LeBron. I think this is the perfect role for him that he's going to settle into now as sort of a like super sub. I think this is true of Wade and Barlow. I think if you take any of the Sixers five projected starters and you take them out of the lineup, whether it's an injury or foul trouble or whatever, and you put Dean Wade in the game, you have a five-man unit that to me makes complete sense. Whether you're going big with, you know, Maxey and Edge comes off the floor and you have Jalen Brown, Dean Wade, LeBron, and B, given Wade's ability to guard on the perimeter, you're not lacking for, utility there, even though you don't have a second guard on the floor. If it's LeBron, he's taking a night off because he's 42. He could slide right into that lineup that he was going to start in before LeBron came here. Even if Embiid is out, I think there are going to be times where they try to tag team small ball center minutes between guys like Wade, LeBron, Barlow, Jabari Walker. All of those guys, I think, have the ability to slide up to the five in a pinch and do that. So I think it's a strong signing. I think it just offers so much optionality. I think the best thing a coach can have is just a bunch of different options at his disposal. And I think Dean Wade is the sort of player that just gives a coach a lot of options.
I'm with you. I like the what I was higher on what his annual salary could be, and so for him to come in a little lower on this deal, I think it's going to be a great value signing. Probably just the most underlooked move the Sixers did, just given everything else they did. And It'll come. I think it'll start to show once the season starts and once they get into the playoffs. So they use the mid-level exception to sign him. Could have signed and traded for him to preserve the mid-level for another big signing, but that would require sitting out a couple players. Cavs probably weren't interested. So they got about 6 million of their mid-level exception left, and having used more than the taxpayer portion, plus in terms of dollar amount and years, are now hard capped to the first apron. They can't exceed that 209 million, which you and I both knew that wouldn't be the case. They would not want to go over that amount anyways, uh, since when we first discussed them. So
Yeah.
then the following day, we got the big news that they're trading for Jaylen Brown. So the trade is pretty simple. Really, not much to like. Not much to explain as far as like the salary cap procedure. Uh, they Sixers needed to send out a minimum of 46 million to match for Jaylen Brown. That's his $54 million salary plus the trade bonus that bumps him up to the max. So they're trading for a 35% max guy. They sent out Paul George. So by using an expanded trade exception, that means they're taking in more money than they're sending out. That's also a hard cappable offense, but they're hard capped already with the Dean Wade signing. So it's really just about not taking back too much money so they could fit their other moves. So they only increase their payroll by about 3.6 million. And along the way, they all traded a good amount of draft equity. Actually, they should say they traded two second round picks. One is a 2028 and one's a 2030. So as part of the package, they traded a 2028 first round pick or a swap. It took me maybe 2 weeks to really wrap my mind
Yeah,
around what
that
exactly.
one is a doozy. Yeah.
But let's see. I have it. I have it. I think I should go. If I go to the Celtics page, I could see what it is. But basically, the Celtics are getting either the Clippers pick if it's 17 through 30. That means they made the playoffs in 2028, which I have a hard time
Seems
seeing. But
questionable.
the Clippers did miraculously
They
go
could have
from Blake
space.
Griffin. They went from Chris Paul and Blake Griffin to Kawhi and Paul George within 2 years. So
Yeah,
it's
possible.
not impossible, but they're
That
also
was a fear
seems
of
like
Sixers fans, is, like the Clippers were set
yeah
up to have max cap space the summer before the season with the 2028 draft. So it was like, oh, they're gonna just find a way to get a couple
yeah.
stars in there right before they go
But
picks.
they also might be in a heap of trouble, so that can really that could really hurt them. So it's either that or if they miss the playoffs, which is probably like the league wide expectation, it is the favorable of the Clippers pick, the Sixers 1 through 8 pick, and then if for some reason both the Celtics and Spurs are both really terrible, then that pick's involved as well, or like the Celtics
Feels
just keep
unlikely.
it. So most likely they're going to get the Clippers pick, I think, based on how this goes, and the Celtics just added all these stipulations to make sure that's the selection that they get, which would
Yeah,
be
I think.
as close to a guaranteed lottery pick as they can get. And
Yeah,
that was the prime asset that we discussed. That one, at least one of the Clippers picks, because the Sixers also still have that 2029 swap, and I'm
yep.
not sure if they could trade it. It's a little complicated. I'm guessing they can't trade it, but we can discuss that at the end. But overall, I like the value for what they're giving up to get Jaylen Brown, who I consider a top 15 to 20ish player. Uh, it seems like they really gave up two first round picks, I think, for him plus Paul George. I don't think they gave up value to get off Paul George based on what this seems like. Because I
Right.
would think that like the picks, it's probably close enough to the value of Jaylen Brown, but it's not enough. I think that it takes away from Paul George. It takes away from like the value of giving up Paul George. I think within the context of the Celtics, Paul George just makes sense. So it's like you're giving up like a slight positive to neutral guy, I think. And with Paul George's contract halfway done, it's not, depending on the team, it's not totally a negative value now.
Yeah, I think that's sort of what makes this trade. Uh, I think that's what made it appetizing for the Sixers. I think everybody was. around the league, and all the, everybody who monitors all this stuff was sort of surprised by how light the return seemed to be for Jaylen Brown. But I think the reason it was light was that there were not a lot of teams all that eager to take on the 3 years left on his contract that were, it was about 185 million, something like that, after the trade bonus was kicked in, 35% max, as you said. And I think what made the Sixers sort of uniquely suited to take on that contract was they already had a giant contract on their books with Paul George. And, Paul George was around, I think it was about 2 years and $110 million left, assuming he picks up his player option for next year. Granted, he was a year away from being a giant expiring, and that could have been a potential helpful trade chip if they wanted to try to get, their next star then, but they decided they wanted to get their next star right now. And I think even if you are of the belief that Jaylen Brown is not actually that much better than Paul George, and you believe what the impact metrics say, and you're part of the group that believes that the analytics properly rate him, he's a very good player, not a superstar, not anything like an MVP candidate, but someone who's just simply very good. Even if that's your belief, just 70-ish games of Jaylen Brown a year is just a much better bet than Paul George, given the availability concerns that he has. He missed more than half of the games he was available for in his 2 seasons as a Sixer. I think played in 79 games in 2 years, so just under half. I think they just looked at this as, we have a fan base that is sort of teetering on apathy that we need to try to re-engage in some way. We know that everybody locally is sort of tired of this core. We have a chance to shake things up in a meaningful way. This, it adds on another year of a contract that, in 3 years from now, you may look at that last year and say, man, the Sixers would be better off not paying Jaylen Brown, $65 million or whatever it is. And I guess that's 28, 29. But it's lined up perfectly with the Maxey contract and the Embiid contract. And you can say also, we just got 6.5 years younger. And this is a team that doesn't want to be as reliant on Joel Embiid moving forward. Not only do you have someone that has a much better chance of being part of your sort of post Embiid future, but you also have someone whose skill set is sort of designed to help you survive when Embiid is not out there more. Paul George, I think, is a cleaner fit, quote unquote, with Joel Embiid. That doesn't always mean a better player to have alongside him, but someone whose role on a team like this is easier to sort of picture in your head than Jaylen Brown, because he's a better off ball player and a better defensive player. But what Paul George can't do anymore that Jaylen Brown, just got MVP votes doing, is self-creating offense. And I think the Sixers look at him as someone who can really raise the floor of their team, particularly when Embiid is not available. And I think that's what made him an attractive piece to them. I don't think that, like, the Sixers making this trade was an inherent statement that the Sixers think that Jaylen Brown is even a top 10 player in the league, or even a top 15 to 20 player in the league. I think it was really, at the very least, just sort of an opportunistic gamble, sort of trying to make lemonade out of the lemons that they had. Like, they had this Paul George contract on their hands. They knew that most people wouldn't want it. There was a unique opportunity where the Celtics wanted someone that could fill Jaylen Brown's position and keep them championship competitive, and they thought Paul George could do that. So they jumped on it. I think even if you're not sort of a longtime Jaylen Brown fan, the rationale behind the trade makes perfect sense. The risk you know, is and was and probably still will be moving forward, that their team is not healthy enough to see what it looks like in the playoffs with Jaylen Brown involved. So it was a wild trade. I did not expect them to be involved remotely on that. I did not think that an offer like that would get the job done. But I'm certainly not looking forward to explaining that 2028 detail to people over and over and over. And I'm just ready for that draft to come and go, so we all know what happened. But it's a hell of a trade. And obviously, what we now know that we didn't know then was that it opened the door for LeBron James to consider them, and he obviously did.
Yeah.
So regardless of how you feel about Jaylen Brown and, the long-term risk of trading, that 2028 Clippers pick probably, and a 2031 unprotected Sixers pick, it opened the door for, what stamped this as, like you said, sort of an all-time off season.
So a lot of stuff you just mentioned, I want to touch on, starting with when we felt that the Sixers shouldn't trade picks for to move Paul George for or Joel Embiid for stuff. I don't think either of us anticipated Jaylen Brown would be on the table, and I don't think either of us thought that Jaylen Brown, what the Sixers gave up, would be enough for Jaylen Brown based on what players are just going for around the league. It seemed like it would have taken maybe a lot more draft equity. You mentioned though, like this is a talent play. I Even if the fit isn't the cleanest thing, it just you are getting a generally consistent all NBA player. You are getting, as you said, much younger, so it's a big age play. And with the LeBron element, if you knew that LeBron was coming, maybe there is a case. Like I think you could make a compelling case that if the Sixers knew they were going to get LeBron for the minimum, maybe you don't trade for Jaylen Brown. Maybe with Paul George it would be a cleaner fit. But then again, like you don't get LeBron without Jaylen Brown.
Right. Exactly.
So while there are some fit issues, I think like that just has to be set aside and try to work through it later. There's like other elements besides Jaylen Brown's fit, and I wonder how Joel Embiid fits. Like there's a lot of different things. There are some downsides. I'm concerned about like what happens with Edgecombe, with his development. Could this potentially kind of stall his development? So there's a lot. There is a lot of things, but I think just with this level of talent, especially getting LeBron at the minimum, it's just one of those things that like all front offices just do this 10 times out of 10 and figure out these issues later. But there is something that I do want to discuss as far as one of the potential downsides in the future, and it is Jaylen Brown's contract. Like no matter how much you like Jaylen Brown, it is still worth the discussion because this is something like that. I don't know how, like, it feels like a very under discussed aspect of why the Celtics traded Jaylen Brown. It's his contract situation. He's making 35% of the salary cap. He got a supermax extension from the Celtics 3 years ago. He just finished the first 2 years. He got 3 years, roughly $183 million remaining. And and I discussed this on the Celtics episode yesterday when we reviewed their offseason. But when the Celtics gave him this extension, the salary cap was booming. It kept going up by the maximum 10% year by year. And it seemed like this was going to continue, that the salary cap was going to keep rising by the maximum, which means it's outpacing the raises, the standard 8% raises players get. That hasn't been the case. It's been a little more volatile where between 2021 and 2023, we had 10% raises. Then it slows down to, I think, 3% for 2024. Then it does another 10% boost for the previous season. And now it only went up 6.5%. So now, if you look at the remainder of his contract, he's still a 35% guy. Because when the Celtics signed him, if you still had those 10% raises, he might be down to like a maybe 33, maybe 32% player. I didn't flesh out the whole math, and I think that's kind of more where Brown's true value is, something like that. So instead, he's still at 35%, and based on the projections, they're a little more conservative. They're going to be like staying at 5%. He's going to be more than a 35% player by the end of this contract. So I think that's something that really went into the Celtics' decision just to trade Jaylen Brown. And when they did, I guess they anticipated that the offers weren't going to get better based on where the cap was going. And I suspect that this context was baked into negotiations to where the Sixers got Jaylen Brown for what a lot of people consider a very good price.
Yeah, I think it was probably the most important factor that led to Jaylen Brown going to the Sixers at this cost was that the Celtics did not want to pay that next contract, and they didn't even really want to pay the current contract anymore. And I think it's completely legitimate. And I think now the Sixers are in a place where they can offer Jaylen Brown a 1 year extension for 35% of the cap. If they don't do that, they could offer him a 3 year extension next year. And at that point,
Yes.
it's 5 years that he's locked in
So
for. That's a ton of money. And I don't think that it would be prudent just thinking about the salary cap. I don't think that it's a smart salary cap move to offer him that contract, but you then run the risk of, if you don't, I mean, you know this even better than me. Like if you have a star player eligible for a big extension and they want it and you don't offer it, and if the season goes the way the Sixers hope, you would think he'll want that long-term security in a place where he feels like he can keep winning. You're going to be in a really tough spot, and that's part of what the responsibility that the Sixers have assumed in that trade, and part of what the Celtics were trying to avoid having to deal with. So that's sort of the difficult quandary that they're finding themselves in now is, do you offer the 1 year extension? If Jaylen Brown doesn't want a 1 year extension, he wants to wait because he knows he can get three next year. What happens next year if you are pretty adamant that it's not worth doing, that you don't want to commit that much money over that many years to him, as he's going to be at that point entering his age 31 season? How do you handle that? And how will he handle it if you don't offer the extension? Is he then going to request a trade? And then, like, are you going to be able to get the caliber of picks that you have traded to get off of him? It's a very interesting question. I think the Sixers have reason to think that this partnership will go well, and maybe they feel like they can reach some sort of middle ground compromise on an extension down the line. But I think that's one of the biggest risks that they assume, and I think you're right to say that the Celtics were sort of trying to get out ahead of having to handle that on their own.
So, Adam, you wrote about this recently. I think this is your most recent post, and you pointed out a lot of good stuff on there. Everyone, you should go read it. Where Jaylen Brown is extension eligible right now, where it's basically what he can do. So, let me take a step back. He was extension eligible with the Celtics going into this offseason for 2 years, looks like $142 million. Because he has 3 years on his contract, the extension can't take him more than a total of 5 years. I wonder if maybe like if there's an indication of a lack of extension coming, maybe also kind of played into things. But once he got traded to the Sixers, he could no longer do a 2 year extension. He could only do one for now because he's got a 6 months trade restriction, where essentially the total value of the contract cannot exceed 4 years for the next 6 months. So, and then in 6 months, it's the middle of the season. Jaylen Brown's not allowed to extend in the middle of the season because he's got more than 1 year left on his contract. Only expiring contracts can extend in the middle of the season. So this 1 year extension, which is I projecting at about 68.2 million, he can only accept it now before the start of the regular season. This amount is either the lesser of a 5% raise off the last year's salary, or the 35% max of the whatever the salary cap is going to be for the new year. So it's going to be something like this, close to 70 million. I suspect the Sixers are going to offer it just out of respect. When you have a star player, it's just kind of customary. Hey, you got this extension. We'll leave it on the table if that's what you want. I suspect he will decline it, and he would wait into next offseason when you only have 2 years left on his contract. He can then add up to 3 years. I would think he would have enough leverage, and if the Sixers do well enough where that's what he wants, then there's something to be discussed. He could also wait beyond that in 2028 so he can add a fourth year. So I don't know how the Sixers are viewing it long term, super long term. I would guess they want some sort of an extension at the very least, whether it's a cut 1 or 2 years, maybe more, just because they gave up draft equity that extends past his contract. So I'm curious to see how this ends up being played. But I would think that this waits at least a year. But either way, this is the big risk that they're looking at. Like this, I would not feel comfortable paying him this much money if that's what it comes to for what will be his year 14, 15, 16 season, I think. But that's kind of baked in when you do these types of trades. But they could also subsidize it with some other moves. So, Tyrese Maxey will make more money. VJ Edgecombe will be on his next contract. By then, I assume Embiid will probably not be on the Sixers. We'll see how much the cap has grown. So they'll be able to figure it out once the time comes. But either way, I would expect some sort of significant commitment to Brown to the 2030s.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. I think the Sixers probably understood that that was expected of them when they made the trade. At least that if we trade for Jaylen Brown and things go well, that we're going to be expected to, make that worth his while. on the back end with another extension.
So that's a lot about Jaylen Brown. Let's jump to then the next move where like the Sixers offseason, just like the offseason, just kept getting better and better. They got Anthony Simons for the tax pyramid level exception. Truly one of the maybe the biggest bargain of the deadline of the offseason, where I anticipated he was going to get a pay reduction. He was making 25 million a year on the previous contract, and just based on how, he got traded twice, small guards are getting more devalued across the league. And it's more so like the role player types. If you're an all-star, Trae Young still getting paid. Austin Reeves not a small guard, but again, he got a max contract. It's starting to hit like more of the role players, and even like the higher end role players, guys like Anthony Simons. We see Colin Sexton, for example. They're getting squeezed. I thought he'd get closer to like the full mid level, like 15 million, maybe even like a little less than that, like a $12 million salary, and you just take like a 1 or 2 year deal and try to build your value up from
Yeah,
there.
and he
He
got
got
forty
half of
percent
that.
of it.
He got half that. Yeah, half that 12 million valuation. I say.
Yeah,
So yeah, just as we mentioned earlier, they needed another. I think they needed another shooter, like another specialist, so to speak, with Grimes heading out and Paul George, who one of their stronger shooters, also not also outgoing. Uh, and they're gonna play like LeBron and Jaylen Brown. They can shoot the ball, but they're not like as strong as shooters as the guys that left. So to get Simons at this amount, that's great. I gotta imagine though, like this is definitely gonna be a 1 year thing. Like I'm sure he'll play the role well enough, hit his shots to the point where he'll be able to opt out and get more closer to maybe the mid level in the subsequent season.
yeah, I would think that's a pretty good bet. I would certainly see how you would come to that conclusion. I think they very much needed shooting, and he was probably the best shooter left on the market, unless I'm missing somebody else. And they needed at the time another guy who could handle the ball. So at the time they
Yeah.
didn't have LeBron. It was unclear if that was really a possibility. They had Maxine Edgecombe, and they needed another guard. They had LeBaron Fillon Jr., who I would say that's another reason why this might be a 1 year stop for Simons, is because the Sixers could sort of develop Fillon behind the scenes this year, play him in spot minutes when you see a lane for it, and then sort of install him in a similar role next year. He's thought to be a very good
Yeah.
long range shooter, particularly
Yeah.
deeper threes, and can add some secondary ball handling as well. Probably projects to be a better on ball player than Simons, but not the same level of shooter. I think it was really good value for $6 million. There are concerns with Simons. He is a major weak link defensively. I think it's fair to be concerned about how that'll translate to the playoffs. But this team is not going to need him on the court at any point to survive. So I think they'll be able to figure things out without him. They have probably three guys that they'd rather run their offense than Simons, so he doesn't have to. When he was in Portland, it always felt like sort of he was somewhat miscast being the primary ball handler, not just the go-to scorer, but also trying to create offense. That's never been his specialty at all. I think this is a great role for him to really hone in on the things that he's best at, and that's really shooting both off movement, off the catch, off the dribble. I think all that is going to be really valuable for this team, and I think it sets him up to, like you said, potentially get a better deal next summer.
The only other shooter I could think of that was technically a free agent was Landry Shamet, but he really wasn't available. He went right.
Yeah,
He
he was
went to
always
the
going to go
Knicks,
back.
committed to them before free agency started. So, uh, yeah, just an amazing deal. I question why some other teams didn't be more aggressive. Sounds like the reporting is that the Heat only offered like the minimum to him, and then like there's also the Pacers who took Oubre. I thought they could use a little more of a specialist, but Oubre is still going to be a great addition there. Other
Yeah,
than that, yeah, just again the Sixers just being incredibly opportunistic and getting players on insane margins. So they use the remainder, almost the remainder of their mid-level exception. They have a tiny, tiny bit left, but they effectively use the remainder of it. 5% raise on the second year, which is the most they could give them on a free agent deal. And they also, in conjunction, I guess before that, they agreed to a 1 year, $3.4 million deal with Ariel Hukporti. So with both Wade and Simons going into the mid-level, they only could give Hook Porty up to this amount with the biannual. Otherwise, the minimum was like $1 million less for him, his minimum salary. So a little, this is definitely like a little, I guess, not aggressive. It's only 1 million more than the minimum, but with teams really within the apron era
No,
trying
it
to get
felt
us,
weird to me. Yeah,
yeah,
no, sorry to cut you off, but it felt weird to me. I very much understand the appeal of Hukporti as a player and like as a prospect and why a team would sell itself, particularly one that needs stability at backup center, why you take a shot on him. To me, it's a player that if you can't take that shot on a minimum, it you sort of question whether or not it's worth doing. At the same time, they did need another playable center, and I think he's probably playable. And for a young guy who hasn't played that much and could conceivably get better, and has the sort of physical and athletic tools that the Sixers were probably looking for in that spot. I think it's an understandable gamble, but it was surprising to me in that it's more than his minimum. So you're now forcing that into the biannual after you sign Simon. So now the biannual is out of the picture for next season, and it's really out of the picture largely for this season because it takes up more the remaining portion of it is I think 2.2, which is less than the minimum. So maybe you can use that mid-season, maybe offer
yeah.
someone a prorated, better than
It's like a
salary, better than the
buyout
prorated
market,
minimum,
like to pay
right? But it's
someone a
not
little more in the
even
buyout market.
right. It's not even going to be all that helpful if they have a two-way guy pop. Like they could just do a 2-year deal if they bump that guy to the standard roster. But ideally, you want to at least have the option to go 3 or 4 years to have more control. So that's why it was a little weird to me. It sort of used up the entirety of the biannual this year effectively, in my opinion. Obviously, there are potential pathways to use it, but in all likelihood, and it completely wipes it out for next year. So they're betting on the combination, I think, of size and athleticism. He can really move for a guy at that size. I think he will benefit a lot when he's playing with this team that clearly is going to lean on transition offense. He's going to, I think, thrive on that. Going back and watching as much of his time with the Knicks as I could, it was clear that he was a real weapon running the floor in transition. Not necessarily always as a lob threat, but even just as a guy who could sort of rumble down the lane and overpower people and move a little bit faster than your brain expects for someone of that size. And the guys that are guarding him usually faster than them too. So it's an understandable gamble. To me, of basically any transaction they made this summer, that's the one that is the easiest for me to question of like where exactly are they going with this? But at the same time, if it doesn't work out, that is now slightly more useful salary filler in a trade than it would have been if that was a minimum deal.
So I have a couple theories of where they're going with this. Number one, most obviously, based on the investment, they must really believe in him. They probably think there's a
Yeah.
lot more left, and they probably view him, as a guy who could potentially be a primary backup big who can play maybe 12 to 16 minutes. And I'm guessing that they don't like necessarily think that's what is expected, but they probably think that is a guy. There is a guy in there that can be untapped. The other element is you're hurting the Knicks by, I guess, subtracting from them. They're still seeking a third big man, even though they got Andre Drummond from the Sixers. But at the same time, the Knicks just they didn't give him an offer sheet. They let him be unrestricted, like because they're playing the margins even tighter. They just did not want to. They had like their set numbers with all their free agents, and I guess they only wanted to give Porty like the minimum, that $2.4 million amount, and the Sixers went ahead and just slightly beat it. So uh, maybe if they knew that this offer an offer sheet was coming from the Sixers, maybe they just decided, let's just go there. It's fine, just because we're not going to match
Yeah.
it. But then the other element, and I wonder, and I think this is the big one, why they invested a little bit more, is that Hukporti still has restricted free agency eligibility after the season. He will become a restricted free agent, and he would get a $4.6 million qualifying offer. So there's that. That's the element of the future play where if things go well, then they can figure out a new long term deal with him. That's slightly above the minimum. Kind of like think the same kind of deal that you had in mind for Dominic Barlow. They can basically give
Yeah.
Porty that similar type of deal with the non-bird rights, which, if he's like a good primary backup big, that would be a bargain deal at $4-5 million a year.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. They had Paul Reed as a backup center hitting restricted free agency a few years ago. The Jazz gave him a very convoluted offer sheet to try to get the Sixers not to match it. The Sixers waited 47 hours and probably close to 59 minutes before they matched that one. And they ended up waiving him
Yeah.
after a year because the second and third years were not guaranteed there. I think that's an interesting point. I had not thought of that. It certainly makes sense in that way. It just the pay bump offers certain areas of flexibility if things go well or they don't. Like I said, if they don't, it's helpful salary filler. You put him with, a minimum player, and you could take back probably around 6 million, 6.5 million back in a trade if you need to upgrade from him with a different backup center or upgrade elsewhere in the rotation. Like if Simons doesn't play well or Phylon does, and you can trade Simons, you could put Simons and Porty together, and all of a sudden you're in sort of the eight figures sort of range as far as what you can take back. So even whether it goes well or not, I think there is a benefit to him making $1 million more than the minimum. The question is sort of if it's in the middle where you're like somewhat satisfied with his minutes, you're not entirely sure. You're certainly not like we have to get this guy off the team, but you're also not thinking about a long term deal next summer. Then which path do they choose? I would imagine they'll err on the side of win now because they now have 41 to soon to be 42-year-old LeBron James on their team. But that's going to be one of the interesting wrinkles when you sort of get towards the back end of their roster. And really I mean, you could argue maybe there's a battle for minutes between like KCP and Dom Barlow. I think really the training camp battle of sorts that we're all going to be focused on
Yeah.
once camp opens in October is Bona and Porty. But both of those guys are going to play.
Yeah.
Like the Sixers third string center spot is more important than any other teams because you know that even if he doesn't get hurt, like by design, Joel is going to miss quite a bit of time, and you need multiple centers on those nights.
So by signing Hook Porty, you use a biannual. That's another hard cappable move, but they already hard capped the first apron. They are also into tax now. They've entered the tax about 5.2 million, and they're not done about $3.4 million below the first apron hard cap. So they went ahead and signed LeBron James. Since I always expected it to be a 2-year deal just so he could get the player option, but the downside to that is that he counts as the full amount, so 3.9, 4.1. It's LeBron James. No one's really crying about that, but if it was a 1-year deal, it would
It
count
cost
as.
them a second round pick.
So we'll get into that next. So it would have he would have counted as $2.4 million, which is about instead so like $1.4 million difference, which is significant because then they went ahead and also are going to sign Contavious Caldwell Pope to a 1-year minimum. Based on the roster construction, they can't fit all that. So they were essentially looking at doing a couple things. They needed to clear 2 roster spots. They did one with Dalen Terry. They waived him. That cleared the space for LeBron. They needed to clear another minimum player to fit Contavious Caldwell Pope. So with Janai Broom, they had a couple options, but they could have stretched him. He had this much remaining on his contract, 3 years, but only 1 year guaranteed, that 2.15 million for this year. So when they could have waived and stretched him, it would have been only this amount divided by 5 years. So the rule is the remaining years
I thought it
on the
would have been
contract.
7.
No, because you declined the team option in the process. So if it was 6
Oh,
years, if you're then it's the years remaining times 2 plus 1, which is 7. But this wouldn't count in the formula.
we all
So
had that wrong then. We
it
were
would
all
be.
operating under the assumption it was 7.
I mean, maybe you could opt them in and do that, but I don't think they'd want to do that. So then it's 4, 2 years times 2, that's 4 plus 1. That's 5. So I guess I put the stretched amount incorrectly. Yeah, let me fix that.
Yeah,
So
I'll just say while you do that if LeBron had just signed a 1 year minimum, none of this would have been necessary. They would have fit a 15-man roster even after adding KCP just by
oh,
waiving Dalen Terry.
I got the stretch amount right. I just only put it 3 times. So
There you
what
go.
they could have done is basically you're dividing that $2.15 million over 5 years, and you would have saved about 700,000 ish or so without giving up an asset. Instead, they decided to trade him with a second round pick to the Clippers to get off his salary. So I don't think we've talked about it. How do you feel about that trade?
I think it's fine. I understand not wanting to incur dead cap hits long term. And after the rookie year that Janai had, and just the fact that the Sixers did not have any leverage whatsoever, I thought maybe it could be a second round swap. That's all it took for the Sixers to dump Eric Gordon at the trade deadline last year. It clearly turned out to be more than that. It's a real second round pick. It could be a good one. My guess is it won't be. I think it's the likeliest scenario is that that's in the back half of the second round. The Sixers have quite a few second rounders at their disposal. I think it's now down to maybe 9 over the next 7 drafts. It's not ideal that they just had to like sort of discard a second round pick. I'm sure that I do wonder if the Sixers thought about going to LeBron and Rich Paul and just being like, guys, if you want a $4 million contract next year, I promise we'll be willing to give that to you. Uh, let's just do a 1 year deal so we don't have to give up a second round pick. Obviously, nobody is complaining. I think a lot of Sixers fans didn't even want Janai Broom on this team anyways. So I think it's really no harm, no foul. It is sort of an interesting salary cap quirk of all of this that LeBron's player option basically forced Janai Broom to move from Philly to LA. Maybe that's for the best for everybody involved. Maybe that's probably a better
Yeah.
situation for him to carve out a role in theory, at least have a chance to play low pressure minutes that he wasn't going to have here anymore. So it's not how you want your first year in the NBA to end by getting traded and salary dumped at that for a guy who was picked 35th in the draft. But I think it was an understandable move.
Yeah.
I would have enjoyed having Janai Broom on the Sixers cap sheet for years to come. I thought that would have been fun to be in like the 2030s and you still see Janai Broom there. I remember Demetrius Jackson was on the Celtics sheet for so long. I don't know if you remember that, but I thought it would have been fun. I was sort of rooting for a stretch for that reason. But I
Yeah.
think dumping him at the cost of a second that is, I think, in all likelihood going to be bad. And if it's good, that means you have another one that's even better that you kept. I think it's fine.
So, in the context of the Sixers, it's fine. And I think they found the perfect trade partner in the Clippers because the Sixers, if they were going to trade any second round pick, ideally a 2028, I've 5 of
They
them,
have a lot. Yeah.
but they also had 3 2027 second round picks, and the Clippers have 0. And they are going to be in need of near term draft equity. So they gave up like a reasonable pick. Like, the big negotiation was more so which pick that the Sixers had they're going to trade. So they're giving up the second favorable of a bunch of different picks. So
Yeah.
it's fine. I think it's fine. I I think I'd rather do that than do. Maybe I could have. I don't know what else you could have negotiated. I would have. I mean, is there a different player? No, no one else you could
It
have
was
really done
really
this with.
it was
Yeah,
Janai Broom or Jabari Walker. They
yeah,
could have waived Jabari. They also could have potentially traded Jabari. I wouldn't be shocked if someone was willing to give up a second round pick
yeah,
for Jabari, who's a proven NBA caliber player. But I also like it. It should be noted that Jabari is a Clutch Sports guy, and I don't think
yeah,
that Clutch Sports is engineering a KCP buyout and then sign with the Sixers
yeah,
transaction to then have another clutch guy get waived as the corresponding move. I think that was
yeah,
always far fetched. And frankly, I think the Sixers were in a place where they valued Jabari more than Janai, and they probably were right to
yeah.
feel that way.
I agree, especially with all the bigs that they have. So with all these moves, they are over the first apron. So
Did we mention that
the
they signed LeBron
yeah,
in between this and the
yeah.
okay?
So they have to waive Dale and Terry. So at the conclusion of everything, so Janai Broom's gone, they waive Dale and Terry. Kentavious Caldwell-Pope still not officially signed as of now, even though the deal was like agreed upon a while ago, and the Janai Broom trade was like almost a week ago. I don't know what the holdup is, but at the conclusion, they're going to be $6.8 million over the tax and $1.8 million below the first apron. So they will, in all likelihood, they're done. for now. They'll keep that
Yeah.
15th roster spot open. They could sign someone by like December, but I anticipate they'll just really not fill up that roster spot till the very earliest January when they could sign guys to 10-day contracts if they need the depth. Maybe just go even longer. Hopefully they're healthy enough. They're getting enough from their two-way guys where they don't need to even use up a 10-day because that takes up like 150-ish thousand dollars or so. They're going to want to keep that flexibility open as much as possible for potential trades later. $44,000 left in their non-tax mid level, so that could be like an end of season conversion. They could use that to give like a 3 or 4 year
Dalen
deal to
Terry
one.
sort of vibe.
Yeah, to like
That's what
either
happened with
Caleb
Dalen.
Love or Ryan Rupert potentially, and whoever their next two-way is. As we discussed, biannual could potentially be used for a midseason buyout where that's more money than what the prorated minimum is going to be. They got these trade exceptions as well, but I don't think they'll really factor much. So the last thing that I think we just kind of should discuss is what any types of moves that you envision around the trade deadline, any sort of like what on the roster are you looking at for potential changes if things aren't quite, and even if they are like booming, even if they're like a top four seed, I still think there are some things that they could improve this roster with.
Yeah, I think the obvious thing that everybody's going to point to, and I've been getting asked about this a ton, is the backup center spot. And we'll see there. My belief and understanding is that the Sixers want to give Bona and Haporti a chance to, whether it's as a tag team or one of them sort of takes the reins, really stabilize that backup center spot. And I think they're going to get quite a bit of opportunity. I think you can and should give looks to LeBron and Wade and Barlow and even Jabari Walker when he finds his way into the mix as a smaller center. It makes you more switchable, gives you a different look, allows you to eat up some center minutes that maybe gives you a better group of five players on the floor. I think that's the obvious one. Whether that is, you trade whichever of Bona and Porty isn't playing as well, whether that's, just a buyout guy, like, with the Clippers buyout Brooke Lopez midseason, that one seems like an obvious sort of buyout candidate who probably makes a little too much money for anybody to trade for him. But he's old enough that the Clippers wouldn't have much use for him late in the year. A stretch five, a rim protector, that's the sort of guy that I think the Sixers would like. The other thing that I think is interesting is like if Simons is playing really well, or even if it's just like sort of roughly what you expected and he's enjoying it and you have a sense that maybe it could be a longer term partnership, is there a Phylon trade to be made where it's kind of you exchanging a young player for another team's young player, or even just you capitalizing on his value as a recent first round pick? I sort of I would liken it to the Jared McCain trade, ironically, because that trade got them this Phylon pick, in that the rationale behind the Jared McCain trade was he's not going to play enough minutes on this team with Tyrese and VJ and at the time Quentin Grimes to, play enough minutes where he's actually worth anything resembling what they were getting offered by OKC, a first and 3 seconds. And so could the Sixers, look at their situation in January or February and say, like, we're not sure exactly when we can work Phylon into all this. We think he's a great prospect. They picked him 22nd in the draft. A lot. I think everybody agreed that was a steal value wise. Some people had questions about the fit and the need. Can we capitalize on the fact that he's a recent first round pick who a lot of teams probably also liked, and get someone, whether it's a younger player that's better fitting for what they need, or just, he's part, like, is it Phylon and Hukporti and a minimum, and that gets you to 10-ish million dollars that you could take back, something in that range. Like, I think there are interesting things you could think about there. I would think it's unlikely. I would think Phylon probably has a limited role this year and then steps into a larger role next year. But I think those are sort of the immediate things that come to mind with trades. They're just not going to have much maneuverability picks wise. They're only tradable first now is 2033 because of this Jalen trade. It had an even year pick and an odd year pick. So that sort of messes up their, Stepien related uh, abilities. So I think those are among the things that you can look at trade wise. Obviously, we have to see what this team looks like on the court and see how it goes. And it'll probably be easier to tell then what their needs are. But I think everybody right here, right now, at least here, is anticipating that backup center will be an area that they're looking to address midseason.
So I pulled up their depth chart. This is my depth chart, just pretty basic. I'm still using like traditional positions in mine, where I could almost say they have like like three third bigs if you want to include Barlow as well in that mix. So
Yeah,
I, yeah, I would see if there's some if no one could really stick out. I would definitely look into seeing what kind of trade there is if you can combine a combination of these guys, like with Barlow 3.4, bonus 2.3. That's close to 6 million. You still have the apron room. I think you wrote about it, some targets you like Eves Misi, who I think a lot of teams are
yeah,
hoping to, to steal from the Pelicans. Jackson Hayes, who I'm sure he can be attainable. Those would be like, you got to dip into the draft equity probably, but that's like seconds. I'm very curious to see the asset management from the Sixers moving forward, or uh, as far as the seconds go, I would suspect they'll dip into quite a good amount of seconds
I
to
agree.
help the rotation. As far as what you're saying about Phylon and Simons, I feel like I'm thinking about it as you were speaking. I feel like it's pretty unlikely he gets traded, because if he's not good enough, then he won't really have much trade value right now. Then they'll just want to keep him and see it, just hope he gets better. Whereas if he's like really good off the bat, like maybe not necessarily as good as McCain was, but good enough to play like 12 to 16 minutes a night, then maybe you could potentially, if that means Simons is really not playing that much, then maybe there's something to be done there. Maybe you can recoup some seconds that way. Maybe you can get under the tax if that's an
I
objective.
I would think, and these are famous last words. Well, I've never said them. I would think that we are at the point where the tax is not a concern. They are going to make so
Yeah.
much money off of the fact that they have LeBron. They have this incredible interest. They're now a national attraction. I think they're going to be anticipating many home playoff games. I I think that would be such a slap in the face to arguably the greatest player of all time deciding to end his career with your team if you maneuver to duck the tax. It would be one thing if they were, $1 million over where everybody gets under the tax. They're far enough above it. They've ducked it enough times. Like this season existing is like to some degree almost their justification for why they've ducked the tax so many times before. If they duck the tax now with this much talent on the roster, with LeBron on the team, it completely invalidates all of the tax ducking that they've done over the last 4 years. And when they traded for Jaylen Brown and they took on an even bigger contract than Paul George that runs an extra year longer, they doubled down on a style of roster building that really requires going into the tax at least occasionally in order to build a team the best way you can. And so I
Yeah.
think the fact that they did that, like that was sort of a warning, a red flag to me when they made the Jaylen Brown trade. Was is Sixers ownership going to be willing to like do what it takes to give Mike Gansey the best chance to pay off this trade by building the best roster he can, or is it going to be build the best roster you can with maneuverability below the tax line at the end of the season
Yeah.
if we can do so? So
Yeah.
I think that is for now a problem of the past. Maybe it's a problem of the future in a post LeBron world, but I would imagine that part of their pitch to LeBron James was making it very clear that, you know, they're happy to pay any expense to try to win and help him win a championship with a fourth team.
I think there's only two ways they duck the tax this year. One is things go horribly, which I wouldn't rule out completely. I think they probably make the playoffs, but the East is just so loaded from like 1 through 11 that, if there's enough injuries on this roster, you never know. Uh, there is like a small percentage chance, like maybe they miss the playoffs. But the other one would be if you trade Joel Embiid, where we talked about the type of trades we would like to see them do from in the preview. Like my favorite one is if you send them to Dallas and got like a combination of guys like Daniel Gafford, PJ Washington, Klay Thompson, stuff, players like that. Then you could stay under the tax to get a little deeper. So I guess the last thing I would ask you is, I'm getting the feeling they're not going to trade Embiid at all. I kind of feel like at this point, just based on what a complete mismatchy was for the Celtics that even for like the small chance, even for like the small possibility, like they make it all the way to the finals and make a deep run, and just to have him there available for like a specific matchup, yeah, he's not gonna. He's making a little too much money just to kind of get rested and like just preserved for that possibility. But they have a roster now deep enough to get you there. I mean, like, what is your whole read on that situation?
Yeah, I think first of all, I would mention just on the point of depth, this team has sort of wasted so many roster spots in the last few years with guys like Kyle Lowry, Eric Gordon, Brendan Watford, and like those guys had their values in certain ways. I think none of them on the court were able to drive home the value of even a minimum contract. And now they have, in those spots are guys like Jabari Walker and Phylon and Porty that you would at least see a vision for. So I think you're right that there is downside here. Like I think that's to me that's what's admirable about LeBron's decision is he's inviting real risk. Like if he went to Cleveland or Miami and it was sort of a disappointing situation and they don't win, like he's already won in both of those places. Nobody's really going to hold that against him. If he does, if this situation goes poorly, it's not like it's going to be a real stain on his legacy, but it creates real disappointment and like a downside scenario and a fan base that is not going to be like, well, look at all these things LeBron did for us earlier in his career. Like those things are not the case here. He has not done anything here yet, and I think everybody here is optimistic about where it'll go. But I just say that to say I agree that there is downside risk, and if you told me they were tucking the tax, I would guess that they got hit with a ton of injuries and they're not playing all that well. And they look at it and say, if we trade Simons, who isn't playing well, and we give those minutes to Flywan, who we just took in the first round, and we dump Puck Porty, and we waived Jabari and we saved the rest of the money on his deal before January 10th. Like maybe that's plausible. But if they're even remotely competitive and not having like a nightmare a la 24-25 when they were really disastrous, I think it's a non-starter.
Yeah,
I think it would be sort of a slap in the face to LeBron.
yeah, no, they won't get under tax. But as far as like an Embiid trade, I think it's more so a lot of these guys need to sacrifice. We're gonna see like how that's the big question. Like, how do these guys who like all range from like 23 to 26, 27 points per game, how does that work? Obviously, you could stagger them. There'll be time missed with injuries, but I guess I think they're gonna want to try to keep Embiid no matter what through the end. And but like unless he's like really like unless like it became a situation where like he's unhappy with the role, not bought into the lesser role. Okay, then maybe that's like the when you look into it. But they've got one of the most talented rosters for the year. Definitely the most talented top five. We'll see how it gels, and I'm excited to see how things shake out. But Adam, thanks for your time. Anything you want to plug?
Yeah, I mean, you can find all my Sixers writing at phillyvoice.com, on Twitter at Sixers Adam, on Blue Sky Adam Aaronson. I've got anything and everything. If I'm sure if you're listening to this podcast, you have an appreciation for the salary cap stuff. I really dive into that a lot, in part with with Yossi's help, and anything from that to feature stories to game coverage, everything in between. Hopefully, going to be on the road a bunch this year, covering what should be an incredibly interesting team. So hope you follow along.
Make sure you guys are following Adam on Twitter and Blue Sky at Sixers Adam. Read his work on Philly Voice, and if you're new here, please subscribe to Third Apron wherever you get your podcast. Subscribe to the Substack, and make sure you're following me on Twitter and Blue Sky. My name Yossi Goslin for instant salary cap analysis as soon as transactions happen.